The room had not been opened in years. Dust sat across the floor in a thin, patient layer, as if the air itself had settled into silence and stayed there, unwilling to move. The faint, colorless light seeping through the boarded window carried no warmth. It only carved out shapes: a collapsed chair, a forgotten evidence marker, the faint outline of a stain that had once drawn officers into a long night they never truly understood. Time felt suspended, like the room held its breath, waiting for someone who had once stood here to return. Investigator Daniel Hart paused at the threshold. His steps were deliberate, steady, almost reverent, as if he were entering a memory rather than a space. He let the quiet settle on him before crossing into the small cabin. The air smelled of dust and old timber. Nothing hostile, simply aged, unchanged since that single night in 2003, when everything shifted around the life of a young woman named Marena Lyle, 27 at the time, a field researcher known in her circles for her calm intellect and solitary habits. Her case had remained unresolved, a thin folder tucked into the deeper recesses of the county archives. Her unique name, once repeated in news broadcasts, had faded into the background of local memory. Nothing about the original investigation had led to closure. No confession, no decisive trail, no reason strong enough to explain why her path ended inside this quiet cabin near a flooded backroad outside Benton County. Hart moved slowly, eyes adjusting to the low light. He wasn't here to rekindle fear or frustration. He was here because the cold air and still floor carried something unfinished, something that had waited too long. He exhaled quietly, steadying himself. The case had never been forgotten by him, even if it had drifted to the margins of official attention. His return now felt less like procedure and more like a silent acknowledgement of not having seen what he should have seen 2 decades earlier. He crouched near the fallen chair. The outline on the floor where it once stood was still visible. A faint curl of torn paper rested beneath it, untouched since the evidence team left the scene. Hart stared at it without reaching. The creak of the wooden frame under his boots echoed softly, shifting the stillness but not breaking it. Fragments of memory crossed his mind, arriving on that storm-heavy night, the lake swelling in the distance, the faint hum of generators powering the temporary lights, the subdued voices of officers trying to avoid raising the tension in the already delicate atmosphere. He remembered the quietness of Marena, captured in the last photograph ever taken of her. Expression gentle, posture reserved, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the frame. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a notebook. Not the official one, the personal one, held for years without any new lines added. He opened to a blank page. A sigh released from him, soft and nearly soundless. This was where it began, or rather where it had ended, and where he would begin again. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The new evidence arrived without announcement, a sealed envelope placed in the evidence intake box 3 days earlier. No return name, no explanatory note, no timestamp beyond what the clerk had logged. Inside was a single photograph. Marena standing near the steps of an old community hall, taken perhaps hours before her final recorded whereabouts. The image should not have existed. All known photographs were cataloged, reviewed, and filed within the initial reports. This one was different. Hart studied it when it first crossed his desk. The edges were crisp, clean, not warped by age or storage. Someone had preserved it carefully. In the background, barely visible near a fractured shadow falling across the west wall, stood the outline of another figure, blurred, yet distinctive in posture. Not threatening, not familiar, just present in a way that felt deliberate. The slight tilt of the head, the offset stance, something about it suggested recognition between the photographer and whoever captured the moment. This single detail carried enough weight to reopen the case, not due to drama or sudden clarity, but because it contradicted the long-held understanding that Marena left the hall alone. Every witness statement confirmed she had stepped out by herself. Yet the photograph indicated quiet company, however brief, a presence that had never been identified or reported. The district office approved the review. Hart knew they did it mostly out of duty. Unresolved files were rare in the county, and any new lead warranted attention. Still, he sensed something different moving beneath the procedural layers. Whoever sent the photograph intended it to be found now, not years ago, not months ago. Now, the timing held a quiet intention he could not ignore. He stood inside the cabin once more, holding the photograph at arm's length to compare the figure in the background with the faint markings near the cabin door frame. Nothing obvious connected the two locations, yet his instinct pressed him toward a subtle link, not in the spaces themselves, but in the silence that lingered around them. A familiarity in the stillness, a kind of emotional residue, impossible to cite in an official report, yet equally impossible to overlook. Near the far corner, the remains of an old evidence box rested on a low shelf. Hart approached it slowly. Inside lay an object that had never been fully explained, a metal key with no recorded lock, no documented origin, found in Marena's jacket pocket at the scene. The report labeled it simply, "Unmatched key, metallic, no engraving." Hart lifted it, turning it over between his fingers. The cool temperature of the metal surprised him. Objects usually warmed quickly in the hand, yet this one kept its quiet chill. Unfamiliar but not entirely puzzling. Many rural properties held outdated locks. The key could belong anywhere. That was the problem. He slid it into a small evidence pouch and tucked it into his jacket. The photograph remained in his other hand. The cabin dimmed further as the afternoon light shifted. Hart felt the room's weight tighten around the silence, the way old spaces sometimes respond when old questions are stirred. He stepped back toward the door, pausing one last time to take in the static scene. Something small had changed. He couldn't name it yet, a sensation, a quiet alertness in the air, as if the room understood that the stillness surrounding it no longer had the same certainty. The case was open again, and the cabin, unchanged for years, would no longer sit in the comfort of being undisturbed. He slipped the photograph into his jacket and stepped out. Investigator examines past reports to identify overlooked details. Back at the county office, Hart spread the old files across the long table in the archives room. The overhead lights hummed softly, creating a steady backdrop that settled his focus. He placed Marena's case file at the center and surrounded it with the satellite reports compiled during the original investigation. Interviews, maps, property logs, photographs, and several handwritten notes from officers who had since retired. He inhaled deeply, absorbing the faint smell of paper, ink, and storage dust that always lingered in rooms untouched by the daily flow of the office. He flipped open the primary folder. Marena's name appeared at the top of the first page, followed by the date and initial observations. Her background was summarized with precision. Born in Little Rock, studied environmental analysis, known for her steady temperament and quiet nature. No disputes with coworkers, no unresolved personal matters, nothing to indicate disruption leading up to her final day. Hart turned to the timeline. The last confirmed sighting placed her at the community hall at 5:42 p.m. She had attended a small research meeting, left early, and was expected to drive home. She never arrived. Her vehicle was later found near the lake road, empty, keys still inside, driver's door closed but not locked. Nothing about the timeline had ever felt contradictory, until now. The new photograph cleaned the surface dust off a detail everyone once accepted, that she had been alone. He scanned the witness list. 12 individuals were present at the meeting that day. Each statement had been straightforward, clipped in tone, routine in content. He read them again, slower this time, listening for subtle inconsistencies. One line caught his attention. A participant had mentioned, almost as an aside, that Marena seemed distracted, like she was thinking about something else. At the time, this had been interpreted as normal end-of-day fatigue. Now, Hart wondered if it pointed to something more intentional, perhaps anticipation of a meeting with someone unseen. He took notes in deliberate strokes, not conclusions, not assumptions, just observations phrased with neutrality. The weight of responsibility pressed softly in his chest. Emotional control had been part of his work for years, but returning to this case brought a quiet guilt he had carried without numbing. He had been younger then, quicker to accept surface findings, more willing to trust broad patterns rather than pursue the smallest edges. Another report drew his eye, a property log from the cabin area. The cabin was listed under a long-abandoned trust, yet a notation scribbled in the margin mentioned an unverified visitor seen in the area a day before the incident. The note lacked follow-up. Hart tapped the page lightly, sensing the outline of a missed opportunity. He continued through the folders, page after page, letting the accumulation of details build a slow, grounded picture. Nothing dramatic, no sudden clarity, but subtle shapes began forming: the key, the silent figure, the overlooked mention of distraction, the unverified visitor near the cabin. He rested his hand on the newest photograph for a moment, silent. Evidence does not speak, it waits. And when it waits long enough, it becomes easy for people to mistake its quiet for absence. Hart leaned back, shoulders steady but eyes carrying a trace of reflection. He had returned to this case because something felt unfinished. And now, as the pieces began shifting into new arrangements, he understood that logic, not chance, would uncover what had remained hidden. The list of potential suspects did not emerge all at once. It formed slowly, the way a faint outline sharpens beneath careful tracing. Hart arranged their profiles along the long archive table, each folder separated by a precise inch. He kept the room dim, letting only a single overhead lamp illuminate the documents. The narrow cone of white light created a soft isolation around each file, as if the lives within them were being examined one at a time, without distraction. He began with those closest to Marena. Not in the emotional sense, she had been private, selective about her connections, but those who had crossed her path in the final month. Relationships in cases like these often appeared ordinary on the surface, yet patterns of proximity carried weight. First folder, Jace Turner. Local surveyor, mid-30s at the time, known for his restless manner and quick speech. His alibi had been firm. He was assisting a team near the Ridge Trail miles away during the time frame of the incident. The team had confirmed it without hesitation. Hart flipped through the original statements again, watching the inked words for inconsistencies. Turner had acknowledged speaking to Marena at the community hall earlier that month, discussing a boundary issue she had flagged during her research. Nothing about the exchange had sounded tense. Still, Turner's name returned repeatedly in property logs around the cabin area, not as an owner, simply as someone passing through for mapping tasks. Hart made a careful note. Second folder, Laurel Pike. A colleague from the research group. She had been among the last to see Marena at the hall. Pike's statement described a brief conversation about scheduling, followed by Marena's early exit. No tension, no concerns. Yet Pike's notes, included in a supplementary folder, revealed subtle competition between their research proposals. Nothing dramatic, Academic disagreements were common and rarely escalated beyond pages of careful diplomacy. But competition had a way of reshaping harmless interactions. Hart added a question mark beside Laurel's timeline. Third folder, Owen Marsh. A maintenance worker stationed near the lake entrance. His record showed no previous issues, no conflicts, nothing that would suggest any involvement. His alibi had placed him in town purchasing supplies. The receipt's timestamp matched his statement, but something in his posture in the interview photograph, eyes slightly off-center, shoulders raised as if preparing for an unseen question, gave Hart pause. Human instinct was unreliable, but it often signaled places worth re-examining. Fourth folder, Rivak Callan. A former friend of Marena. The relationship had cooled in the year before the incident. Their last communication had been short, polite, distant. Riva had been at a family gathering the night Marena was last seen. Multiple witnesses supported her statement. Still, the emotional history lingered beneath the surface. Tension rarely evaporates without leaving a faint mark. Hart did not categorize her as a suspect, but as a presence, someone whose quiet distance might hold context, if not motive. He leaned back from the table, letting the details settle around him. None of the individuals held clear intent. None showed direct conflict. Their motives, if present, were thin, stretched across ordinary interactions. Yet cases built on subtlety often unfolded through the smallest inconsistencies, the kind that only appeared once every detail had been lifted, tilted, and studied under consistent light. Hart returned to the cabin property notes. The unverified visitor from the day before Marena's death had never been linked to any of the suspects. The note provided no description, only unfamiliar vehicle seen at trail access. That entry bothered him more than any motive. An unknown presence, unaccounted for, offered a shadow in the timeline that nobody had addressed. He shifted the files again, creating a second layout. Suspects positioned around the central timeline, each with paths crossing or diverging from Marena's final hours. As he traced their movements on paper, subtle patterns emerged. Turner had been near the ridges frequently. Marsh's route to town placed him close to the lake road before dusk, a detail not considered relevant at the time. Pike had left the hall within minutes of Marena, though she insisted they departed in opposite directions. These were not contradictions yet. They were threads, thin and silent, waiting for tension. Hart closed his notebook and rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. No suspect stood out more than the others. Each carried a plausible alibi, yet each also brushed against Marena's last days with just enough proximity to leave faint imprints. The room remained still, but something in his chest tightened. Logic demanded patience, not pressure, and so he allowed the pieces to remain incomplete, trusting that small details would rise with time. Clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. The next morning carried a dim grayness across the sky, the kind that softened the landscape rather than illuminating it. Hart returned to the office early, unlocking the archives room with a quiet motion. He carried a thermos of dark coffee, though he barely drank it. His focus remained on the unfolding pattern, subtle, restrained, like a whisper of movement beneath still water. He began with the photograph again. Marena on the hall steps, soft afternoon light across her profile, a faint tilt to her posture suggesting she was mid-conversation. And behind her, the blurred figure, the silent presence that had opened the case again. He enlarged the print on the office scanner, not for identification but for structure. The shadow cast by the wall, the angle of the figure's shoulders, the slight lean to the left, these details suggested not a passerby, but someone waiting for her attention. A familiarity in the spacing, a quiet expectation in the stance. He revisited the meeting transcripts. One line from Laurel Pike captured his focus, Marena stepped out early, didn't say much. She looked like she remembered something. Remembered something. Not forgot, remembered. Hart checked the timestamp of Pike's own departure, 6 minutes after Marena. Not long enough to dismiss, not close enough to claim pursuit. But the phrasing stayed with him as he moved to the next file. From there, he examined the Lake Road reports. The tracks near the vehicle had been unhelpfully smoothed by rain, but the notes mentioned 2 distinct shoe patterns. One was Marena's. The second had been labeled unidentified, partially washed. No follow-up footprint analysis had been performed. Rainfall had made the task futile. Still, the presence of 2 patterns aligned with one element. She had not been alone before reaching the cabin. He paused, letting the realization settle. He wrote the connection in his notebook, deliberate and steady. Next, he retrieved the key. The small metallic object sat in the evidence pouch on his desk. He examined it under the desk lamp's gentle glow, tilting the metal to catch the light. No engravings, no manufacturing marks, but the teeth were uneven, almost worn, as if repeatedly used on an older lock. A cabin lock, perhaps. One not included in county maps, maybe a storage shed or an unlisted property. Rural areas carried many such spaces. He retrieved older property listings that predated the abandoned trust. Among the records, he found a reference to a second structure near the main cabin, a tool shed removed in 2005, 2 years after the case. Its lock had never been documented after demolition. The key suddenly felt heavier in his hand. He placed it at the center of the evidence layout. Then he returned to the emotional details, the quiet conflicts, the softened edges of tension hidden beneath polite statements. Laurel's subtle competition, Turner's repeated presence near property boundaries, Marsh's quiet discomfort in his interview photograph, Rivaz's once close friendship that had faded without explanation. Hart leaned forward, elbows on the table, breathing slowly through the growing weight of emerging patterns. It wasn't a single motive that would unravel the truth. It would be the convergence of small emotional imprints, the kind that rarely appear in reports but shape human behavior with quiet precision. He arranged the reports again, using a new approach. Instead of focusing on alibis, he focused on what each person might want to avoid revealing. A missed detail here, a softened description there, a hesitation buried in a single phrase. Motives were not always loud. Sometimes they lived in the spaces between explanations. A shift occurred when he returned to Turner's folder. The boundary dispute he had discussed with Marena seemed ordinary, yet the attached map revealed something subtle. The disputed line cut near the area where the unverified vehicle had been seen. Turner had been documenting that section extensively. His presence explained one detail, but not all. Then Hart lifted the meeting notes again and found a smaller inconsistency. Pike had insisted Marena left early without mentioning plans, but another attendee, in a short line tucked into the lower margin of her statement, had said, she said she needed to check on something before heading out. The note had been overlooked because it lacked detail. Still, it reinforced something intentional in Marena's departure. Hart's eyes narrowed in quiet recognition. He returned to the photograph. The blurred figure. The posture. The slight lean. Not waiting by coincidence. Waiting with purpose. As he studied the grain, a chill passed through him, not of fear, but of understanding the delicate threshold between clarity and error. Logic pointed him toward a truth forming at the edges, and emotional conflict threaded through the details, quiet disappointments, unspoken competition, unintended pressure in relationships that had seemed stable from the outside. The clues didn't shout, they whispered. And slowly, the whispers aligned. Hart lifted his pen, ready to outline the converging path. A path pointing not toward the most obvious suspect, but toward the one whose presence had blended into the background for years. The emotional core of the case had begun to reveal itself, not as drama, but as a quiet shift in understanding. The shift arrived not from a moment of revelation, but from a slow tightening of logic, the kind that draws a circle around a truth until resistance becomes impossible. Hart sat alone in the archives room, the lamp casting a faint amber glow along the table edges. The files lay open in a deliberate arc, each page flattened and steady under his hands. He breathed quietly, the rhythm calm, steady, almost measured against the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. He began tracing the timeline again, not from Marena's last confirmed sighting, but from the small details surrounding the people who had touched the case. Small, overlooked marks, each one carrying a subtle weight. The clues he had collected, the blurred figure in the photograph, the key, the tension hidden beneath minimal statements, began converging towards someone who had never once been treated as a suspect. Not Turner, not Pike, not Marsh, not Rivet. Instead, the pattern pointed backward, towards someone present not as a character, but as a structural element of the case. The maintenance worker who had submitted the early property notes. The person who had logged the cabin's water damage years before. The one who handled initial access during the investigation, ensuring officers could navigate the outer area safely. Eldon Varr, a quiet man in his 50s at the time of the incident, had been assigned to logistical support roles in the county's rural maintenance division. His name appeared in the margins of early reports, not as a witness, not as a suspect, but simply as a functionary. Practical, unremarkable, invisible by nature of his work. Hart pulled the archive binder containing maintenance logs. The entries were sparse, organized by month, with signatures at the bottom of each page. Most were clean, precise. Then, near the week of Marena's disappearance, Hart found a small notation he had overlooked. Cabin access checked, lock compromised. Signed by Varr. Compromised. A strange word for a remote, aging structure rarely visited by anyone. Hart leaned forward. The key, the small metal object found in Marena's jacket, matched the era of locks referenced in Varr's logs. Older constructions, phased out in certain rural zones. The wear pattern on the key's teeth suggested frequent use, but not by Marena. Someone else had handled it often before it ended up in her possession. Varr's roots during that week placed him in proximity to the community hall for grounds work. More importantly, the time sheet placed him near the lake road the following day, cataloging debris removal from a week-old storm. No one had examined his movements closely because his job required him to be everywhere, a constant presence across the county, seen by everyone yet noticed by no one. Hart returned to the photograph. The blurred figure behind Marena, not tall, not rigid in posture, not leaning with impatience, but with familiarity. A presence accustomed to waiting. Someone who knew her schedule well enough to approach without raising suspicion. Varr had maintained the research hall grounds for years. He would have been around her routine without being part of it. Hart retrieved the interview notes from 2003. Varr's statement had been 2 lines. Didn't see her that day. I was clearing debris near the old mill. Weather was shifting. Didn't want to be on the road by evening. Minimal, passive, neither defensive nor forthcoming. Hart examined the date of the debris clearing assignment. The work order had been issued 2 days after the disappearance, not on the day Varr claimed he was there. His statement had slipped through the cracks because the focus at the time had been on Marena's meeting and vehicle location. Rural maintenance schedules rarely drew scrutiny. Hart closed his eyes briefly, letting the pieces settle in alignment. The photograph. The key. The unverified vehicle near the cabin. The compromised lock. The quiet presence around the hall. All pointing, quietly but firmly, toward the least conspicuous link. He stood, collected the relevant files, and headed down the hall to the records office. Under the muted fluorescent lights, he searched for VAR's employment termination date. He found it at the bottom of a personnel file. Retired 2009, moved out of state shortly after. No forwarding address listed, just a handwritten note left quietly, no issues. Hart pressed his hand against the file cover, not in hesitation but in acknowledgement. The logic was precise. The emotional undercurrent was muted. There was no satisfaction in the discovery, only the steady acceptance of a pattern finally revealing its center. He began reconstructing the events. Marena left the hall early. She remembered something, perhaps a meeting arranged in passing, perhaps a question she wanted resolved about the cabin's boundary line. VAR, familiar with her research routes, approached her outside the hall. He may have held the key, may have hinted at something she needed to see. She trusted easily in neutral environments, grounds workers, maintenance staff, familiar faces around administrative buildings. She followed him to the cabin. A conversation occurred, hesitant perhaps or quietly tense. Something shifted, a conflict internal rather than external. An argument without raised voices. Something subtle. Something that made the atmosphere precarious. And then, a moment where things tilted irreversibly. Whether he panicked or acted under pressure, Hart could not determine. But the aftermath had been carefully shaped by routine. Her vehicle placed near the lake road, the cabin left untouched except for small signs officers would later label as inconclusive. The key slipped into her pocket, perhaps by mistake, perhaps in the final moments. All of it stayed silent for 2 decades. Hart stood in the quiet room, the story now complete in logic if not in detail. The least suspected person, the one who blended into the county's background, had been the missing piece from the beginning. There was no triumph in reaching this conclusion, only the cold clarity of truth resting in place. Ends with moral reflection. Truth isn't always visible on surface. The following week unfolded with mechanical procedure. Hart documented his findings, compiled supplemental reports, and submitted them for administrative review. Officials examined the evidence with careful neutrality. The conclusion remained the same: logical, restrained, supported by patterns rather than emotion. They issued an acknowledgement, not closure, not accusation, simply an affirmation that the trajectory of the case had finally aligned. Hart returned to the cabin one last time. The air remained still. The dust had settled again, thin and even across the floorboards, as if erasing the footsteps he had left during his earlier visit. He stepped inside, quiet as before. The same collapsed chair, the faint outline, the stagnant smell of timber and forgotten weather. He placed the photograph on the low shelf, beside the remnants of the old evidence box. He did not need to keep it anymore. The blurred figure had served its purpose. The truth had emerged not from the photograph itself, but from the structure of silence around it. Standing in the center of the room, he let the weight of the years settle through him. Not regret, something quieter. A recognition that even careful eyes can overlook what blends too seamlessly into its surroundings. Truth does not always appear where light shines directly. Sometimes it lingers in marginal notes, in quiet presences, in unremarkable names written in the corner of a page. It hides not because it is cunning, but because it is ordinary. and the ordinary has a way of appearing harmless until logic sifts through the stillness. Hart exhaled softly. Justice in its formal sense would never fully reach Var. Time had taken that possibility, but truth, the quiet, unembellished form of it, had finally surfaced. It felt neither victorious nor hollow, simply present. He closed his notebook for the final time. As he stepped out of the cabin, the late afternoon light stretched across the clearing, soft and indifferent. The air held no resolution, no epilogue, only a muted calm. The world continued, unchanged by what had been uncovered except in the thin space inside him where understanding lived. He paused at the doorway, looking back once more. A room frozen in time. A life interrupted. A truth long overlooked because it resembled nothing unusual. Justice felt mechanical, procedural, structured, necessary. But something human remained beneath it, quiet and steady, refusing to fade with the dust. He closed the door gently behind him, and the silence reclaimed the cabin, as it always had.